Welcome to Sober Sunrise, a podcast bringing you AA speaker meetings with stories of experience, strength, and hope from around the world. We bring you several new speakers weekly, so be sure to subscribe. We hope to always remain an ad-free podcast, so if you'd like to help us remain self-supporting, please visit our website at sober-sunrise.com. Whether you join us in the morning or at night, there's nothing better than a sober sunrise. We hope that you enjoy today's speaker.
Okay. I'm David Thatch, and I'm an alcoholic. And my sobriety date is March 9th, 1992, and I'm a member of the Primary Purpose Group in Spartanburg. One of the finest group of men and women I've ever spent time with in AA, and I hope I get time by the end of this thing to tell you a little bit about them. I try to do so anytime I can. I'm told that I'm supposed to tell you in a general way what I was like, what happened, what I'm like now. So, I'm going to do my best to not make a fifth step out of this thing and get into too much detail. And I'm also told that I'm to tell you this to tell you how I came to form a relationship with a higher power that's enabled me to stay sober. And I'll do my best. A lot of times I don't get to that very well because I had a really hard time with that. I came into this program as an atheist and did not find God very easily. In little bits and pieces as I went along is how it went for me. So I'll just get started and see where we go from here. I was born in Pascagoula, Mississippi, and stayed there for a very brief time, moved on to South Carolina by the time I was 3 years old. So, for practically my whole life I've been in Spartanburg except for in and out with school and that kind of thing. And growing up, when I started in this thing, I would have told you I had this horrible childhood and all these things that went on. But, I've listened to enough fifth steps and I've spent enough time with people that had a real bad time to know that I was really pretty lucky. But there was a lot of yelling and screaming and a lot of being told that I was stupid or lazy and things like that really kind of sink in, And the end result of it was, I was a kid that just didn't feel like he fit or measured up anywhere. And I had that feeling as long as I can remember. My earliest memories of being embarrassed or being uncomfortable, not like the happy opening the Christmas presents, but the being uncomfortable wherever I was. And, you hurt my pride and I remember it forever. And it's just how I was. And I've said before, and, I always felt like I walked into a room with a booger on my nose and my fly down, and I checked before I came in here, that doesn't go away easily. But, that's just how I felt. And so, by the time I found alcohol, I was ready. I was ready. One of the things that I'd done about it, though, I found a solution prior to alcohol. And it was something that I've come to know the solution is today. It's the funny thing, I found it on my own. Was I got real involved with my church, and I was real involved in Boy Scouts as a little kid. And, what I found was the service work, the projects that we did for underprivileged kids and things like that were something that made me feel all right about me, made me feel closer to God and closer to you. And strangely enough, that's the solution I got today, too. And I found that. But what happened with that was by the time I was about 12 years old or so, one of these little projects I had done for the hospital, a children's unit, got some attention, on local news, and it was announced at the school I was in, and I was humiliated. That was not cool. It was not cool to be a Boy Scout and be helping people, of all things. And I was really embarrassed, and I quit all that at that point. I just dropped that, dropped church, dropped God, dropped all that. And shortly thereafter found alcohol. Got to be honest with you. First thing I found was marijuana. It was illegal, so it was a lot easier for a little kid to get than it was alcohol. And I love that. And my story, drugs are there all the time, the whole time. And I don't share that a lot about that. This is Alcoholics Anonymous. Also, I don't share about that because I'm not an addict. I was confused about that when I came into AA. I had a lot of people convince me otherwise, and I realized, I dropped all that by a simple decision to stop and change the people I was hanging out with. Never worked with alcohol. That had nothing to do with my drinking. And so, shortly after doing that, we got to pursuing alcohol. It wasn't something I found by accident. We'd heard that worked. And we got together with a friend's sister. We were going to a little middle school dance. And, feeling like I felt, I wasn't going to a dance too easily anyway, and we found a a sister that would buy something for us, and I had my first drink. And what she got was what she thought little kids could drink pretty well, something that would go down easily. So my first drunk was on malt duck, which was the awfulest stuff. It came either in 4 or 8 packs or something, I think 4 packs, and it was red and tasted horrible. But what happened to me that night was one of the things I read in the doctor's opinion that happens to people like me, people we call alcoholic, is, I drank all I had. Immediately upon getting enough in me to feel it, I got a craving for more of the same. And I drank all I had. The other kids with me, they drank what they could. They drank what they could, and they fell down and got in all kind of trouble. What happened with me was when I drank all I had, I got comfortable. I was immediately okay. I walked into this little place where I would not have been comfortable and felt like I belonged. And man, that was a solution for how I'd been feeling. I would have been a fool not to pursue that at every possible opportunity, because it worked, and it worked quick, And so I did. And all throughout school, I was a pretty regular drunk. Early on, it was a little harder to get, but as I got into high school, I was a pretty regular drunk, not daily, but not any less than 4 or 5 times a week, and arranged things in such a way where I could do so. Part-time jobs with alcoholics, I could drink there and things like that. And in the meantime, things were getting pretty bad at home. It had been pretty bad, but it started getting bad when I started drinking, because I started reacting and things got nasty, and there was a lot of fighting and a lot of anger. And the way it kind of worked was, my dad had hit me, I'd hit my brother, and we all get on my mom. And it just like that all the time. And, I started spending a lot of time away from home drinking. By the time I got in college, I was free. That's where my drinking changed for me, was I didn't have to hide anything. There wasn't anybody there to tell me what to do and when to do it, really. And I'd been getting away with drinking because I was an honor student. And I was one of the kids that was supposed to do very well. And any little trouble I'd gotten in high school was excused away because I was one of the kids they liked, and one of the ones that was supposed to do really well. And I carried that on into college. I was a scholarship student. I was an art student down at University of Georgia, and I got a lot of excuses for my drinking and behavior there, because art students are supposed to be kind of goofy, and I was goofy, and I was one of their good students that they wanted to do well. So if there was a problem, they'd excuse it for me, at least for a while. So I really started bottoming out with my drinking by the time I was 19 and 20. The physical stuff started showing up by the time I was 19. I was drinking every day, and I was drinking most of the day. And by the time I was about 19 or so, I started waking up with what we get, the shakes and the sweating and the just not knowing what's happening, about to crawl out of my skin, and realized if I took a drink in the morning, everything would be all right. That it made the day okay, and I got over it. And so, by that time I was doing that drinking around the clock, not 24/7, but drink when I get up, do what I had to do, drink at lunch, do what I had to do, and, drink all night until I fell asleep. And, that was pretty much the routine. Didn't take but about a year of that. My drinking career is not real long. 12 years old up to beginning to realize I need to quit by the time I'm 20. Didn't actually quit then, but I knew I had a problem with alcohol at that point, or thought I might. But by the time I was 20, I wasn't able to go to class. And dearest friend I had in the world, she came to me and said, "David, I don't know what to do, and I don't know how to help. But maybe these people can help," and gave me a card that said Alcoholics Anonymous. She had written it down and a phone number. And I drank on that for a while. I don't know. It may have been a day or two, but, thinking about it, because I knew, this wasn't how I intended to go through college. And I called it one night, and I talked to the guy. An older gentleman answered the phone, and God bless this guy. I know he was doing the best he knew how to do. I know. And I talked to him for a little while, and I asked him, what do y'all do at those meetings? And he said, "Well, we drink coffee and we talk." And I said, "Okay." And we talked a little while, and he said, "We really don't have anybody as young as you in our group." And I thought, that's just what I needed to hear. I was too young to be an alcoholic. I had suspected that because I knew alcoholics were really pretty old. And he confirmed that for me. That's all I needed to hear, And I said, "Well, thank you and good night." And that was the last of my dealing with Alcoholics Anonymous for at least another 6 years. And I managed to get on through college, do what I need to do, being confronted only by some doctors that I used to like to go see and things like that on occasion. Got another scholarship and went on to graduate school and carried that drinking with me, and the game changed up there. You know, down in Athens, it was all right to be a goofy art student and be kind of strange and drink in class and stuff like that. I got up to Eastern North Carolina, and that's a pretty conservative bunch, and they looked cross-eyed at me when I started moving a refrigerator into my studio, and I'm supposed to be one of their graduate assistants, and I thought it was all right to do that, and I had no idea it wasn't okay. You know, I didn't, and they weren't real happy with me. And what happened up there was the thing that used to be my solution and enabled me to do things I couldn't do, you know, because stuff like this, I had a history of being terrified of talking in front of other people. Still do, you know, to some extent. And so I would drink, you know, I'd go to class and lecture and drink, or anytime I had to do that kind of thing. Well, up there that didn't work, and it became the thing that kept me from being able to do all the things I needed to do. And it didn't take very long before, you know, even though I was doing very well in school, I needed some kind of solution, and I bailed out of that. And I found a solution. I decided I'd come home to Spartanburg and get married. That'd make everything better. And that's what I did. I came home and married a girl I'd been dating, drinking just as I had been, and barely working, you know, not really doing a whole lot. I was painting and selling some artwork and that kind of thing. And something changed about my drinking during that, too, as I became everything I hated. You know, not only was I having to drink when I got up just to be okay enough to get on with the day, I became a violent, angry person when drinking just about every time I was drinking. You know, my first reaction to that was stop drinking brown liquor, because I knew I was going to kill somebody if I drank brown liquor anymore. At least, you know, at least white liquor and beer didn't have me jumping up and down on somebody's car in traffic like brown liquor did. And so I did that. But as we went along, what happened was, you know, I'd been blaming everybody for my problems. I could pretty much get by with whatever happened drunk by blaming it on being drunk. Oh, I was drunk, everything's all right. Oh, forgive me, or whatever. At some point during this thing, what I did while drinking was hit her. You know, and there might be people in this room that think that's all right, you know, and that's okay if you can live with that. But that was one of those things that, you know, this girl's 5 foot tall, 95 pounds, and I couldn't really get up the next morning and feel like that was okay. I couldn't find some sort of way to blame that on her. You know, I couldn't find some sort of way to just say, well, I was just drinking. That was no longer okay. That was no longer an excuse. I'd done something I couldn't live with and look in the mirror without wanting to throw up. And, you know, I mean, I knew I had a drinking problem, but I thought, you know, generally I was all right. Well, that changed there. I knew that wasn't okay. And I'd love to reach a point here saying that I went to Alcoholics Anonymous and everything was wonderful, but that's not how it happened for me. I started a couple of years of trying to not drink without the aid of Alcoholics Anonymous, because, you know, I was going to go to any lengths to avoid AA. I did not want to go to AA. I told you I was an atheist guy. And I knew a lot of them met in churches, and I knew it was related, and I didn't want to have anything to do with that. And so I went to the doctor and told him what had been going on, and, you know, probably a little bit honest with him about what had been happening. I needed to stop drinking. And he looked at me and he said, well, yeah, you probably do. And let me give you a prescription to help you while you stop drinking. And he wrote me a prescription for Xanax.
All right.
Yeah, I know. And now I wasn't honest enough to tell him I'd been taking that anyway. And I was also one of the guys that, you know, when you look at the side of the bottle and it's got a red label that says, warning, alcohol may intensify the effect. I took that as instructions, you know, not as a warning. And that didn't last real long. I mean, it didn't take a day or two of that to make me want to drink badly, as it always did. And things got bad and things got worse, and I was just as ugly and nasty, and I came back to the doctor again. And I asked him, I said, don't you have something that would make me sick if I drank? You know, I really need to stop drinking. And he said, well, yeah, I do, and it's called Antabuse. And I want you to read all this. And he threw all this paperwork at me, and I read it, and bottom line was it said, warning, it may kill you if you drink on it. And I said, kill you if you drink? That's good. That's what I want. I don't want to drink, and if I drink and die, good, okay. And I started taking my Antabuse, and And what happened, I don't know how long. I don't know how long it was, because I was taking my Antabuse and drinking coffee and doing some of what I knew you're supposed to do. And at some point, what happened to me is what the real problem with alcoholism is for me. The squiggly writing in the book. Is I was sitting around on my Antabuse, happily not drinking, and started thinking, well, I wonder how much you'd have to drink before it killed you. And I began a period of, probably my only period of social drinking that I ever had, was sipping on a beer up to the point I started feeling the Antabuse. And I mean sipping, not guzzling, just sipping at it until I'd feel it and I'd turn beet red. All the scars on my body would light up and it'd feel like somebody stabbed me right here. And I'd start sweating. And then I'd ease back off. And then when that eased up, drink a little bit more. And that went on for weeks and weeks. That was my social drinking. And what happened, I'd go out with friends. Most of my friends weren't alcoholic. Most of my friends were normal, decent people that would drink on weekends, and stop when they wanted to. And they may overdrink a time or two, and they'd go out with me and I'd be doing my Antabuse drinking and they'd just laugh. And they'd come up and say, "Are you enjoying that, David?" And I'd just be like, and just having an awful time. And I did that for a while because that's it. The problem I've got around alcoholism isn't that when I take a drink, I get a craving for another drink and can't stop. It's not that when I take a drink and get a craving for another drink and can't stop, I get violent or go to jail or throw up or any of the other kind of things. It's that dead cold sober, I start thinking like that. Not wanting to drink and taking something that hopefully would kill me if I take a drink, I start thinking, well, how much can I drink on that? And proceed to try. That's the problem I got. The squiggly writing in the 3rd chapter, where suddenly he thought, and that's the problem I've got. I've got a mental problem around alcohol. I don't see the truth around alcohol. I had lost the power of choice in drink. It wasn't about you have a choice today. I'd lost the power of choice in drinking, just like the book told me. And I would start thinking crazy stuff, and it would seem okay. It seemed all right to be doing that. But at some point I realized, this Antabuse and drinking is going to kill me, and I quit taking Antabuse. And it wasn't very long before the wife quit taking any of that, and she left. And then I realized, well, she was kind of a problem anyway, so I can drink. And wasn't long for the police picked me up again and thought, well, you can't drink. And went back. And went back to the doctor, went to a counselor, and started seeing a counselor to talk about my drinking, knowing, if we figured out what was wrong, then I'd stop drinking. If I understood me better, was a book called it Self-Knowledge, might make it a little bit better. And started talking to a counselor, but like I told you, I'm nervous around folks. I am uncomfortable around people I don't know, especially if they want to talk about me. So I would drink a 6-pack or so to go talk to a counselor about stopping drinking. And I did this twice a week, I think, week after week, Drink a 6-pack, go talk about not drinking, do it again. More of the squiggly writing. That's just, it seemed okay. That seemed like that was normal. It seemed like that was a way to go about this. And I think what it was the same problem I had later in AA, is I thought he was going to say something magic that was going to be the answer, and I just lose a desire to drink. Bam, Well, it didn't happen. And at some point, I guess I drank enough to forget to go and went on like that. I said I was going to try to get to how I came to a belief in God in this thing. And, what I've come to understand is I've come to a belief in a higher power working in my life by looking back, by evidence of Him being there when I wasn't paying attention. And that's kind of what started happening for me, as I found that all the people I needed were at the right place at the right time. Things I could have missed by 10 seconds happened right when I needed them to, when I was ready. And that's what happened. Shortly after this counseling experience, I tried to minister, and that didn't work out much better, drinking and talking to him. And but I was going down to get the paper in the driveway, and a guy came by. I'd worked with this guy while I was doing the Antabuse experience, and he laughed at that, and he just loved that. But he'd also shared with me at that time that he was a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous. He didn't tell me I needed to go. He just said, I find this works for me, while I'm doing Antabuse and drinking on it. And but that's all he did. He just told me what he had done. He told me a little bit about what he had been like. He shared a lot of stories of his. And then when I lost that job, left's not right, I lost that job, and moved along, I lost touch. He moved out of town, and I moved somewhere else in town. Had no idea where this guy was, wouldn't have known how to call him. And I was down getting the newspaper one morning after another bad time. See, I'd gotten involved with another woman to fix it, and that violence I brought into that, she was just that violent. She was just that violent without drinking. And it was ugly. It got ugly from day one. I thought she'd understand. She's a bartender. What better person, She didn't understand. And what was going on there was, while we were doing what we were doing, arguing, fighting, knocking each other down, her little 12-year-old girl's laying back in the back listening to all that. And just like that time hitting that wife, it's hard to wake up the next morning and think that was okay to have her go through that night. And the only way that could make it okay is take a drink and it'd happen all over again. Well, about the time all that was happening, I'd had all I could stand to me. I just had all I could stand to me. Go down to get the newspaper, and this guy just shows up. He just happens to drive by. I could have missed him by 10 seconds. He'd have never known I was there, and he stopped and talked. And I didn't tell him at that time everything was going awful. I didn't tell him I needed a drink, and I couldn't stop, and all this kind of thing. It just kind of put him where he needed to be. And a couple days later, things got bad and worse, and I called and talked to him, and I said, what do y'all do at those meetings? That seemed to be my going to AA question, was, what do y'all do at those meetings? And he gave me an answer that wasn't your big book. It wasn't profound. All he did was, say, David, why do you go to bars? And I gave him every answer other than get drunk. I said, to be around people I got something in common with, to have some friends and not have to hang out by myself and people to talk to. And he said, that's all we do in AA. We just don't drink while we're doing it. Nothing profound. And I agreed to go. I said, will you take me to one of those meetings? And the next day he showed up in his old unmarked police car and picked me up and drug me down to a place downtown. And man, I'd love to say I walked in and heard the message and got sober. It wasn't like that. It was another couple of years. But I don't remember what went on. It was bright. That's what I remember. It was brightly lit, and my head hurt. I think it was yellow at that time. And I think I picked up one of those chips when they offered them. And I think it was probably because he went, ooh. And I went for a little while, though. I wanted to go back the next day. I'd sensed, I guess, there was a solution there. I knew I'd used up everything I knew. I mean, doctors, ministers, girlfriends, family, everything. I'd used it up. So I started trying to go. And, one thing I failed to mention at that time, too, is right about that time with my family, things had got worse than I ever thought they could. And, it was about my 26th, maybe 25th birthday, and my dad and I celebrated in the front yard by beating each other up. Just fist fight right out in the driveway. That was that whole deal. That was the thing that happened just before this guy showed up and kind of put me ready. I'd used up family. They weren't having any more of me after that. Just used it all up, and I started going to those meetings. And my experience, years ago I'd have told you, maybe I wasn't ready. Maybe I just wasn't ready, but I don't know about that. Looking at it now, I went into a group full of crazy people. It was an Alcoholics Anonymous group that was full of crazy people. And the people I hooked up with, like all the crazy people came to me and offered me help. And I thought this was great. I thought, man, this is good. These people care about me. They're concerned about me, and they're offering me help. And that's great. I never had a place like that. And then I met this pathological liar that couldn't get one honest word out, and it was to the point where, unsolicited, come up and tell you lies. Another guy moved himself into my house and ate the last bit of food I had in the fridge, brought his dog with him. Then there was another guy that offered me help, and I really needed help. I'd drunk again, and I called him, and he said, and told me where he was, and said, come on down, and I'll talk with you. And I got down there, and that's a little hole-in-the-wall bar. And he's in there drinking and told me he's going to pick up a 90-day chip tomorrow. I know that's not right. I really don't want to drink. I don't want to drink, and I know that's not right. But, I think that's the kind of thing you get in a group that doesn't have strong sponsorship. Is crazy people run wild and take advantage of new people. I've got some pretty definite feelings about that nowadays. But, it didn't take long before that girlfriend that I'd been fighting with, who really wanted me to go to Alcoholics Anonymous, felt like I should stop going to Alcoholics Anonymous if that's the kind of people I was going to meet and hang out with. She didn't want me to have what they had. And I agreed with her, and I stopped and started drinking again. And I went on drinking for about another maybe 6 months or so. Really bad drinking, the kind that you do when you don't want to be drinking. You just got to be drinking. And what happened, I went through something I had never gone through before. I'd been through morning jitters. I'd been through sickness. I'd been through violence and anger and hurting everybody that ever cared anything about me. But I hit something new that I didn't know about, which was DTs. I found out if I quit drinking too quickly, stuff happened. And, when I spent an evening crawling around in the floor, hearing sirens and trying to get to a telephone just to call an ambulance. If I could have dialed, I'd have done it. And I was just hearing screaming and ambulances and that kind of thing. It got my attention. And I woke up and felt I need to call A&A again. And another thing that happened for me that I think, when God puts people that I need where He needs them for me, I think is what it is one of the guys that this man that took me my first meeting introduced me to, and introduced me on first day, and this guy handed me a business card with his name and number on it. And, I kept that in my wallet, and I called this guy that day when I got ready after those DTs, and he was there. And he was still sober in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I didn't realize at that time what a miracle it was, because this guy wasn't but 90 days sober when I met him. And I didn't realize the turnover rate we have in Alcoholics Anonymous at that time. I do now. I know it was an absolute miracle that man was still sober. Because we'd like to convince ourselves we're more successful than we are, but we're not. And a large number of the people sitting around here today aren't going to be here next year. And this guy happened to be sober, and when I called him, I said, "Can I come back? I didn't know if they'd let me when you quit." And he talked to me and said, "Yeah," and we hooked up. He became my first sponsor. And I like to say I got sober. It wasn't like that at all. I drank for another year and a half. And what happened with me, I tried to make some efforts at some steps, and I would drink, like I'd make it 3 days and drink. And then I'd make it a week and drink. And then I'd make it 2 days and drink, and I'd keep picking up white chips. And then I'd make it 30 days, and I'd get brilliant, and just start sharing and take drunk on the way home, And, picking up white chips till they stop clapping for you, they just kind of go, Or, I finally reached the point where I figured the white chips were the problem, and I just quit picking them up, That obviously was the problem, But I just kept coming back. If I didn't do anything else right, I followed that one instruction of keep coming back. And what I think now the problem was I didn't know what the problem was. I didn't know what I had. I thought I did. I thought I walked into AA and understood I had alcoholism. I didn't know what that meant. I really did start out this thing thinking it meant when I take a drink, I take too many. And that's it. I didn't understand I'd lost the power of choice and drink. I didn't have a choice. I was hearing people tell me things like, choose not to drink today, and didn't realize I can't. It's not possible for me. Make a decision not to drink. Had no bearing on whether or not I drank that day. Remember your last drunk. I didn't realize what the book tells me, that there's a time and place. I'm not going to be able to do that. It's a good tool when it works, but for a drunk like me who doesn't have any choice, I get into squiggly writing, and then suddenly I think, and I forget what happened that made me want to stop drinking. Play the tape through didn't happen. Didn't happen. When I was ready to drink too late, playing the tape through didn't happen for me. No willpower-based solution was going to work for me. But I didn't know what I had. I didn't know I didn't have a choice. And the only thing that happened for me is I got miserable. I even tried, I'd gotten a girlfriend in AA over here. And she was staying sober and I wasn't. I thought, hell, she was staying sober. That helped me. Should. She and I are going to a lot of meetings together and she's doing well. And nothing was working. The end results, about a year and a half of going 90 days a couple of times till they let me chair a meeting, and I get brilliant and take drunk. And all that was, I just got miserable. I'd been laid off from a job, started drinking. I was supposed to chair the Friday evening speaker meeting because I was brilliant at that point, and they're going to let me chair the meeting. And I did. Showed up drunk to chair the meeting and chaired it. And if I'd have had the power of choice and drink, I would have drunk on the way home, not on the way there, And what happened was, Beth had had enough of me. My friends, in AA, they'd had enough. My family no longer believed AA was my last hope. They didn't see that work, and I knew AA didn't work for me. I'd been doing what they said. I went every day, and it didn't work. And I got miserable because I'd made some good friends over that year and a half or so. I'd met people that I really cared a lot about, and they cared about me. And they were staying sober, and I wasn't. And that's a really lonely place to be. I'd cut out the drinking buddies, so all I had was me. And that was a really bad place to be. I knew I was going to die drunk. My mother was coming up to visit, and I decided, well, I'm going to stay sober just long enough for her to think I'm okay. And I couldn't make it till 10 o'clock that morning, and something in me broke. Something in me broke. I knew I was going to die drunk, and she got there, and I said, I need some help. I need some kind of help. I'd been resisting having them lock me up somewhere because I had a lot of important business and things I needed to do, or AA was all I needed, and they needed to lock me up somewhere. And she picked me up and took me back to Alabama. And if I'd have had my choice, I'd have been in a treatment facility, eating 3 nice meals a day, talking about my issues. And God gave me what I needed, not what I wanted. And I was in a psych ward in a place down in Alabama where people had problems far greater than what I had because they didn't have a solution for what they had. And what happened was God put before me people I needed to meet, and they weren't. Special alcoholics who had a great message to share. One was a little girl named Natalie who had fetal alcohol syndrome. She looked like she was about 7, but she was really 15. She wasn't going to be okay. And it was from drinking, and it wasn't her fault. And she was a sweet kid. Made friends with another little girl that was about 12. Looked a lot like the daughter of that girl I'd mentioned earlier. And she had just come out of a body cast from being thrown down a flight of stairs by her alcoholic father. And she was in there, and that was alcohol. That wasn't her fault. She didn't have anything to do with that. And a lot of people like that. I met a lot of people abused by other people's drinking, and somehow or another that made a real impression on me. And just before I left that place, they rolled a guy in on a wheelchair, and he was talking a lot of AA slogans. A lot of good talk would sound good around a discussion meeting. And I talked to him. He'd been sober 25 years in Alcoholics Anonymous, and moved down there and didn't really like how they did it, and quit going. And wasn't too long that, being older, his wife passed on, and he began drinking. He couldn't even walk. He knew what to say, but he wasn't even walking. And I paid attention. I still know today I got to do this at least 25 years. I got to do that. But, I hadn't had a drink since that time either. And what was different this time, I thought about it a lot, and I didn't know. I don't know. First of all, something in me broke. It wasn't anything y'all could give me. Something inside me had to break. That thing in me that thought I could avoid the next drink. And it left an opening where I needed to find a higher power because there wasn't anything else. And I came back here, and during that last drunk, I'd talked to a couple of guys. One big black prison guard named Hilton who intimidated the hell out of me, and a little biker named Stitch that intimidated the hell out of me. Both of them scared me to death. And I called them round the clock, and they talked to me every time. And I'd call up until it's time for them to go to bed. Then I'd drink all night, and then I knew, okay, they're getting up at 6, and I start calling again. And they talked to me every time. Not once did those guys say, call me when you're sober. They knew I wasn't drinking because I wanted to be. They knew I was drinking because I had to and couldn't stop. And they talked to me. Well, when I got back, I got with Stitch, and I got with Hilton. I stuck more with Stitch. And he got me over to his house, and he pulled this thing out, and we sat down and started reading. And strangely enough, when you don't go through the doctor's opinion and skip to how it works, you find out what you got. And it explained to me that an alcoholic like me didn't have any choice in drinking, and that I was going to have to find a higher power, or I was sure to drink again. And he spent some time explaining that to me, and I understood it this time. He also shared with me a set of these Joe and Charlie tapes that I listened to because I, drew for a living. I'd listen to tapes over and again. And they told me the same thing. An alcoholic of my type doesn't have power of choice in drinking. I better find a higher power by using the steps of this program. And they explained it in such a way where I understood it. And they were telling me things I wasn't hearing sitting around the groups I was sitting in. They were telling me exactly what I had. They were telling me the problem, the solution, and the program of action to bring about that solution in a real simple way. And that's what I did. I didn't have any real belief in God. But what I read was all I had to have was a willingness to believe in God to get started, and that was all I needed. I'd been trying to start with a faith I didn't have. People were saying you got to have faith. I didn't have belief, and what was I going to do? And this thing told me I just had to be willing, and I was willing. Alcohol made me willing, and I was willing to do that, and I proceeded on with just a willingness to believe in a power I didn't believe in. And I got with the guy and did the third step, and I just did it like it said, got on my knees and prayed with this man, not because I had a big belief in God, but because I knew he did. I knew he believed more strongly than anybody I knew in that room, and I wanted that, And I did that with him, and I did the inventory and wrote down, who I'd harmed, who I resented, and all the whole deal that we know in here, and I shared that with another person. I became willing to change. I didn't want to be the guy I'd been anymore. I didn't want to hang on to any of that. Unfortunately, a lot hangs on, but I didn't want to be like that. And I think some of the important stuff I did got to the amends process. Was I had to make amends to my family. I told you what it was like around the house. I told you how my dad and I were. Something had to be done there. And with my mother, she just loved me. She was just scared to death, and it was pretty easy to talk with her. And she just wanted to know I was all right. She just wanted me to let her know I was okay on a regular basis. And what I've done with that since that time for the last 12 and a half years or so is I've called her every Sunday night at 6 o'clock without fail. Unless I'm going to be away, and then I let her know where I'm going to be and try and call from there. And done that over and over again. With my dad, it's a little tougher, I did the basic amends, and somehow that didn't feel right. That didn't seem to be complete. And Father's Day rolled around, and I wrote him a letter. And this time what I did was, rather in the past how everything he had done wrong was what I focused on, I wrote him a letter about how everything that he did do right, and how I was proud of him for coming off the farm in Mississippi and seeing that I had a life better than he grew up with, and how I had opportunities that he didn't, and I was really proud of the man he was. And things changed. Things changed little by little, as I went on. There wasn't any more telling them I'm doing wonderful, telling them how sober I am. They just needed to see action this time. And so that's kind of where I went from there, One of the things that was real important for me in recovery from early on was the idea of service. I heard it mentioned a lot, read it in the book, and what I'd noticed was the people that seemed happiest in recovery were involved in giving back to Alcoholics Anonymous. And I wanted that, and I didn't have a whole heck of a lot to offer, but I was in a clubhouse type thing, so there were things that needed to be done, and what I did was clean, and do yard work, mow the grass. I'm a little obsessive. I asked if I could paint the walls, and we ended up remodeling the whole building, but that whole time I didn't take a drink either, and I was scared to go home after a first shift job at 3 until the meeting time, so that put me there doing stuff and kept me away from drinking, I think. It gave me a purpose and made me feel pretty good. And what happened was that group became mine rather than your group that I visited. It became my kind of place, in my place. I had to be there. I had commitments. And I think, where I got into service kind of stuff I seem to be into a bit today is it started real funny. It started by a sponsor of mine way back. I'd go to meeting, we'd call. Sponsorship was so important for me. I couldn't talk in front of y'all. I tried to go to meetings that were big enough where I could hide, and I'd go back and talk to him about what they talked about. And he'd say, "Did you read?" And I'd say, "No, they gave that out before I got there." And he'd say, "Well, I'm sure if you asked, they'd give you something to read." And I'd do this, and we went for weeks, of him saying, "Well, did you read?" And I'd say, "Well, no, they gave them out." And until, sometime later I made this big leap and was able to run home after a speaker meeting and say, "Joe, I read the long one," A guy out of college scared to read how it works, But I was terrified of you guys and talking in front of you or doing anything like that. I was going to mess up. I was going to mess up. And that kind of started some things. And the older guy came along and he said, "Well, David, I'd like you to consider doing treasury for this group." And I said, "Dave, I'm no good with money, I'm no good with checkbooks and paying bills." And he said, "Well, David, this is how you become good at it." And I had made a decision that if AA asked me to do anything, I'd do it. I really would. And so I just said okay, and I found out I could do it, and that is how you get good at it. And then they, come along about the time you get good at it and say, "Oh, this is mine," Then they say, "We would like you to do this," And the end result was I found out something I didn't know about me. I'm far more capable than I ever gave myself credit for. I'm far more able to do more things than I know about. That I am competent, I am responsible, and somewhere along the line it became very important to do what I say I'm going to do, be where I say I'm going to be, when I say I'm going to be there, without fail. And I think doing that kind of thing gave me that. And not only did it help me in sobriety, it carried its effects over into my business life, where I find I can talk to people in a way that I never could before, because I always felt down here and them up there. As now I can deal with people eye to eye, look people in the eye and know that I'm all right, because I'd always hated my own guts. I think one of my favorite things I ever got involved in service has been going to the Spartanburg detox, and got going down there like once, twice a week, every week, and doing what we do, just like the book says, do it. Tell them about me, not about them. Tell them what I was like. Tell them about my drinking, and did that without fail, over and over for years. And what happened there is I got very, very interested in these guys' experience. When I was saying the serenity prayer at the detox, I was not saying it alone. These guys had been in AA. There were very few first timers. And I decided to talk to these guys and find out a few things, because I think sometimes we too quickly write off, well, they just weren't ready. I don't know that. And I asked them what their experience was, and they said, "Well, I went to those meetings and I, heard a bunch of people griping and moaning, and I got kind of tired of that." Or, other things. They just, I'd ask them what step were they working on when they drank, Well, I was on step 3. That's a thought and a prayer. What I found out or came to believe is that many, many people quit Alcoholics Anonymous without ever being exposed to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, without being given the opportunity to do what we do that can free them from the obsession with alcohol. I mean, free them, not just give them a little relief. And got real interested in that. I told you I was going to tell you about my group if I had a little time, and these guys are great. We just had a good time. We got real interested in having a place where if one of those guys came in, they were going to hear the problem, they were going to hear the solution, and they were going to hear the program of action to bring about that solution. That we decided we'd just take our meetings and we just take them out of the book. We have 2 meetings a week. Monday night, 7 o'clock, we have a literature-based discussion. Somebody brings something out of one of the conference-approved books, reads it, and that's what we talk about. We don't ask if anybody's got a problem. We assume you got a problem if you're in Alcoholics Anonymous, and you need a solution. And that's what we talk about. And it's gone real well. On Friday night, we've got a big book study. We read one page at a time, and we talk about what's on that page. We don't read the white parts. We just read the black parts, and we talk about our experience with that page. And we've been doing that for a couple of years now, and works real well. What's happened as a result is we've had some guys come in and find the value of sponsorship right quick. and understand that if they work the steps in a timely manner, they can get sober in a timely manner and maybe be released from obsession with drinking. I know everybody's got their own opinions on that, but if I'm bleeding to death, I'm not going to go to the hospital a year from now. And, these guys do the steps quickly, and they make amends, and what I see is they get happy. Because if I can't be happy in Alcoholics Anonymous, no reason to be here. And these guys seem to get happy, and they carry that happiness back into their lives and their jobs. And things are good with their wives, their kids. They're being fathers and mothers again. And it shows. And we were in the meeting this morning here at 8, reading Working with Others. And, it talks about to see a fellowship grow up about you. These are things you won't want to miss. And that's true. I wouldn't miss that for the world. I've seen how that can work. I was sharing in the meeting this morning, one of the neatest experiences I've had in the last year was one of the saddest too, was when my last sponsor was dying of leukemia. And spending time having meetings with him at the bed and seeing a group of 14, 15 hairy-legged guys all kneeling around the bed doing the third step prayer together. And watching him try to help folks. And what I had was the experience of seeing exactly what this tells me about the fellowship growing up about you. Is at his funeral, I looked around and I noticed the guys he sponsored and the guys that they sponsor and the guys that they sponsor and those that they sponsor all there, 300 or so people. All there just by carrying a simple message of, I don't have a power of choice in drinking. And here are the things that I had to do in order to get sober, and I'd be willing to help you do them if you'd like. And if not, I got to move on. And that seems to work, and I think I probably shared all I need to tonight. I'm very happy to have y'all ask me to come down here. And y'all have a good evening.
Thank you for listening to Sober Sunrise. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give it a thumbs up as it will help share the message. Until next time, have a great day.